Good morning, everyone. If I could have your attention, we're going to get the session started. My name is Adam Auer. I'm the Director of Sustainability with the Cement Association of Canada. And on behalf of the CAC and all of our member companies, thank you for coming to our session, The Climate Resilience Imperative, What Canadian Municipalities Can Do Today. We're very pleased to see such a strong resilience theme at this year's conference. In our view, adapting to climate change is the most important challenge facing municipalities today. And as our President and CEO, Michael McSweety, mentioned this morning, it's one where we think municipalities must lead. We hope to achieve three things with our session this morning. First, to reinforce the need for and urgency of adaptation and resilience. Illustrate why municipalities are and must continue to be on the front lines of climate adaptation and resilience. And to share some lessons learned and hands-on experience from a municipality that is recovering from a recent major climate event. We're very happy to have someone from the City of Calgary here today. We're very excited about the three panelists we've assembled today. I'm going to introduce them in just a couple of minutes. But I thought in light of some of the presentations that we've heard over the past couple of days, and in the spirit of Brock's comments this morning about trying to find that pivot point between resilience and sustainability, I thought I'd take just a couple of minutes to talk about how I see what the relationship between the two concepts are, and in particular why I think resilience is actually a really positive development for municipalities and their sustainability investments. Sorry, I have to operate two computers here. So I don't know how many of you attended the opening session yesterday where the mayors of Whistler and Yarmouth were speaking about the strong emotional reactions that some of their constituents have, and some of their councillors for that matter, to any policy or program that's got the label sustainability. For some, sustainability is inherently too expensive or too socialist or ultimately just kind of meaningless and trendy. I don't totally share that cynicism, but for even for those of us who have drunk the sustainability Kool-Aid, if you will, it's a pretty difficult concept to navigate and communicate a lot of times. And I think it's certainly true that sustainability has become one of the most overused and perhaps misused word in the English language. And this is a little comic strip that I think captures the concept very well. The word sustainable is unsustainable. And it projects in 100 years or so that all of our sentences will just be sustainable, 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 repeated over and over again. Resilience, on the other hand, I think has a deep positive cultural meaning. It speaks to our sense of self, our strength, our courage, our perseverance, adaptability, and innovation in the face of adversity. Resilience is our ability to hang on and continue to thrive no matter what the world throws at us. It's a very compelling and inspiring message. And I think it complements sustainability without some of the baggage that I think sustainability seems to have collected for some of us over the years. Where sustainability calls for a balance and harmony and to a certain extent restraint, resilience offers some wiggle room. It's often visualized, you see on the right here, as a ball in a valley. As long as you don't push that ball over the crest of the hill, it will always return to the same place. It's not about avoiding all impacts, but about making investments that secure our ability to weather the storm, not just bounce back, but bounce forward, as you often hear in the context of resilience, by drawing strength from our experience. Resilience offers an inspiring way, I think, for municipalities to make investments and to take actions, difficult actions at times, that enhance our ability to live and thrive within the limits of the natural world, which is really what sustainability is about. So what does this mean for municipalities in practical terms, particularly in the context of climate change, which is what we're discussing today? I think this quote from the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force captures it quite well. Extreme weather has eliminated the option of simply building back to outdated standards and expecting better outcomes after the next extreme event. Here in Canada, after events like the Calgary and Toronto floods, or even Hurricane Juan here in the Maritimes about 10 years ago, I think the concept of resilience can create space that municipal leaders need to think and act differently about their everyday infrastructure decisions and challenges. As we heard this morning from Michael McSweety, many resilient building strategies like improving water and wastewater infrastructure management to prevent flooding or implementing energy-saving smart grid technology also increase the efficiency, livability, vibrancy, and yes, the sustainability of our municipalities every day. To reiterate again from Michael's speech this morning, done right, an investment in resilience is a no-regrets investment that improves lives today while providing a measure of security against the uncertainties that lie ahead. Concrete will obviously play an important role in municipalities' resilience investments, and so we know that we have a responsibility, our industry has a responsibility to contribute to the resilience conversation, including how to optimize the use of building materials to get the most long-term value for money, for the environment, and for resilience. One example, I see there's some colleagues from Quest here, the district energy gurus. They often remind me of a pilot project out in Vancouver that's using concrete pipe to capture heat from the wastewater system and use it for district heating. So you get a durable, long-lasting, climate-resilient solution to wastewater management while also producing free, carbon-neutral heat that reduces loads on your utilities. It's exactly what we mean by no regrets, a no-regret solution. And just one more quick plug. We mentioned this morning that the Cement Association worked with the International Institute for Sustainable Development on a paper called Climate Adaptation and Canadian Infrastructure. The paper was released in November last year. It summarizes peer-reviewed literature on climate adaptation, in particular, with a particular focus on its impacts on Canadian infrastructure. We think it's a great introduction into the urgency of adaptation and what we might expect in terms of impacts on our infrastructure across Canada. If you'd like to see the paper, it's available on our website, which is rediscoverconcrete.ca, or you can also find it on the International Institute for Sustainable Development website. If you prefer, just come see me at the end of the session today. I'll take your email, and I'm happy to send you a copy directly. So without further ado, we're going to delve a little deeper into the topic. Now I'm going to introduce our first speaker. First up, to my right here is Dr. Blair Feltmate, who is a professor at the University of Waterloo and deeply involved on the issue of climate adaptation in Canada. Some positions he holds include Chair of the Climate Change Adaptation Project Canada, Co-Chair of the Extreme Weather Task Force, City of Toronto, and Board Member for Sustainable Hamilton. Prior to joining the University of Waterloo, Dr. Feltmate was Director of Sustainable Development with OPG, and before that he was Vice President of Sustainable Development with the Bank of Montreal. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Blair Feltmate.
So I'm very happy to be here to talk about extreme weather, why we must adapt, and more specifically, what I'm going to focus on are the following points. First, I'm going to say just a little bit about distinguishing between efforts to address climate change from the perspective of mitigation versus adaptation. And I've already gathered that I was only here today, I couldn't be here yesterday, but I think people have a fair sense of what these terms mean, but I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes defining them. I'm then going to turn to a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out late last year in reference to human activities and how they relate to climate change, and in particular through the burning of fossil fuels, and what our future looks like in reference to our continued dependence on fossil fuels and how that's going to affect climate change going forward. And I'm going to use the first and the second points to culminate in the third point, which is to address the reality that, in my view at least, climate change is a done deal. That ship has sailed, and we really need to focus on adaptation far more aggressively than has been the consideration to date. I'm then going to turn more specifically to how extreme weather is affecting one particular industry sector, and it's the area of property and casualty insurance in Canada. And I work very extensively with some of the leading in property and casualty insurance companies in the country in overall efforts to determine or focus on how can we de-risk Canada from an extreme weather perspective. And at the end of the day, that is the game. How do we de-risk the system? And if we don't de-risk the system, we're going to continue on the path we're on, which right now is categorically heading towards an uninsurable housing market in large parts of Canada. So we've got to get this stuff right, and we've got to get it right rapidly. And then I'll end with a few overall conclusions in that dimension. So that's the direction we're going to head. Now, when we talk about adaptation, I think probably everybody here in the room knows what we mean by adaptation, but just in case, on the left-hand side of the slide, I illustrate it with a few examples. We can engage adaptation from a variety of perspectives of not only built infrastructure, which is a large part of the discussion at this gathering, but also we can engage adaptation from the perspective of maintaining natural infrastructure, i.e. wetlands, for example. leaving wetlands intact functions as a progressive adaptation initiative in and of itself, because wetlands left intact with natural vegetation there functions as repositories, if you will, for water to gather and accumulate over longer periods of time and discharge over longer periods of time, as opposed to if we had wetlands that naturally may look like this, but we've denuded them down to this situation with no natural vegetation there. Water flows into that region and flows out very rapidly, causing flooding. So we can engage an adaptation initiative very cheaply, simply by launching a national mandate to maintain wetlands in their natural state, or work to help bring them back to their natural state. Other initiatives, and I know you're all well familiar with this, so I hit these quickly. We can have initiatives to put, for example, in reference to building codes, we can mandate that backwater valves or check valves, whatever you want to call them, be installed into the drains in the basement of houses. A check valve that's put in place there can function in such a way as that it allows water to flow out of a basement if your dishwasher or washing machine is overflowed. But during high intensity duration of rainfall events, if water wants to back up through the sewer system into your basement with one of these little guys in there, it can very much work to help stop that from happening, stop the water at the point of the check valve. So it allows water to go out but not come in. It's a very cost-effective adaptation initiative. When you're building a house new, to put one of these things in costs about $300 per house, which if you take a house that it doesn't matter if it's $200,000 or $2 million, it's immaterial on the cost of the house. In other words, it's an adaptation initiative that costs nothing. And one of the points here I would like to make is very often people think of adaptation as something that it's always costly, and that's not true. There's an awful lot of things we can do, the so-called low-hanging fruit out there, that we can operationalize in Canada from an adaptation perspective that doesn't cost too much. Now, other initiatives are more expensive. We can build bioswales into communities. These are areas where water can deposit to during high-intensity duration rainfall events. They're basically large cement ditches open on the bottom filled with plants and rocks and things. If you call it a bioswale, it sounds more official. But the water flows properly located within a city. The water can flow into these locales, and in so doing, it may not end up flooding someone's basement or storefront properties and so forth. And the return on investment for the structures on these is huge. We can have channelization in some parts and localities within cities, which we're going to hear a little bit about later on, whereby we can direct water away from city centers. We can develop riparian buffer zones along water courses as initiatives pertaining to adaptation. Maintaining just even, in some cases, the natural sinuosity of streams, the way they meander and wiggle around and so forth. That in and of itself, with a riparian buffer zone, there's another fancy word, trees and plants along the edge of the river, it can also function as an adaptation initiative to decrease the probability of flooding. Now, if we're building large-scale channels to direct water away from the downtown cores of cities in the future, such as the initiative at Calgary, if we're building dry ponds and whatever, those are more meaty investments to which their money is attached. So adaptation runs a gambit from being highly, highly cost-effective. Well, it's all cost-effective and a good return on investment almost at whatever stage you're at, but some things you can initiate for virtually nothing, and some are a little bit more expensive. On the mitigation end of the file, which is the other end of the equation where probably still 95% of efforts are directed and thinking is directed towards addressing climate change, people talk about mitigation, and that is reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And how might you do that? You might do it through, as generally perceived, through putting electric vehicles on the grid, generating electricity through windmills. We may have solar panels. You're familiar with those initiatives. We can have larger initiatives, such as, for example, getting off coal. In the province of Ontario now, I used to be at OPG, we're off coal-fired electricity generation as a means of reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions, in this case, at the level of the province. But that's costly, because when you get off coal, you've got to get on to something else. And it's either nuclear or natural gas or some other alternative, hydropower. Or we can engage efforts in the mitigation world pertaining to carbon capture and sequestration, which is the picture at the bottom in the center there. And these are also expensive operations. These are efforts whereby you'll work to capture greenhouse gas emissions as they're being emitted, usually from coal-fired or fossil fuel-based electricity generation facilities. You capture those CO2 emissions and pump them into the ground and store them there. but that's not cheap. For example, the carbon capture and emissions program that's underway in Saskatchewan is about somewhere around $120 to $140 million to put in place. So my point in all of this is, for Canada, we have to do some fundamental thinking in reference to the allocation of resources we should be directing towards adaptation versus mitigation, and it is a versus, because governments at all levels, municipalities at the municipal level, provincial level, federal level, they're out of money. So any money you spend, any amount of money you spend on one effort is money you're not spending somewhere else. So the point is, you got to get it right. And it's not just money, it's money, brain power, labor, etc. Where should we be channeling our efforts optimally for the country? What makes the most sense? And that's a little bit of what I want to address here. And if we don't get it right, we're going to continue to have the situations that we saw last summer with flooding in Toronto, Calgary, and in seasons before that. We're going to have situations that look like this. This is what it looks like when you get it wrong. Here's a collapsed transmission power. This is the Don Valley Parkway in Toronto, and this is about the only time you don't see it bumper to bumper with cars. The only reason the cars aren't there is because it's flooded. It doesn't work no matter what, basically. Or we have a situation here in the lower right-hand corner. This is an area of Toronto, if you know Toronto, at the north end of Toronto, between the 401 and Downsview Airport. There's an area there where we have a couple of hundred houses that were flooded out 3 times. The community completely flooded out like this 3 times last summer. And this is a community that's not on the bank of a river. This is a community of hundreds of houses that if you drove through the area right now, there's no streams, rivers, creeks, nothing. It's not like they built a house on the side of the Bow River and people go, well, what did you think was going to happen? This is an area where we have non-riverine ephemeral floodplains. And in this particular area, what we have is the confluence of 3 major storm sewer systems that come down through the region. And during high intensity duration of rainfall events, the water comes completely up through the sewer systems, floods out the entire community to the point that now we have effectively an unsolvable problem there. The people that own these houses now, these houses are almost worthless, and they can't sell them, they can't remortgage them. They're being denied, in many cases, insurance going forward. And this has created a situation that we don't want to see more of going forward. But these situations are happening a lot around Canada right now. And it's going to get worse if we don't focus on adaptation rapidly. And by the way, this is not a cheerful talk. And if you think you're depressed now, you're going to be more depressed at the end. So so now I just want to turn a little bit to talk about the relationship of human activities to the emission of greenhouse gases affecting climate change. And just what do we know? What's the state of knowledge at this point in time? Well, here's the reality of the situation, and I've taken these quotes directly from the Intergovernmental Panels on Climate Change's report. This is an assemblage of several hundred climate scientists. Their recent report that documents the relationship between human activities, the emission of greenhouse gases, climate change. What did they say? So these are their words, not mine, and this is not my words. And this is the authoritative body in the world today. This is the best of what we know about science. At the top, they say, it is extremely likely that, which, by the way, never happens in science, extremely likely. In other words, it doesn't happen, except here. It is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And the climate has changed. It has changed, is changing, and will continue to change. We're up about 0.08 degrees Celsius per decade, each decade over the last 100 years. So the world's mean global temperature is up about 1 degree Celsius over the last 100 years, which at first you might listen to that and think, well, geez, that's not such a big deal, 1 degree Celsius. But remember, the difference in global temperature between now and the last ice age was 5 degrees Celsius. So 1 degree Celsius is a big deal. Atmospheric concentrations of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, so greenhouse gases, have increased to levels unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. So for about the last million years and longer, we've had about 285 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now we're up over 400 parts per million, and as you'll see in a minute, that line is just going to continue to go up, guaranteed. CO2 concentrations have increased by 40% since pre-industrial times, primarily from fossil fuel emissions. And global surface temperature change for the end of the 21st century is projected to likely exceed 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius relative to an 1850 to 1900 baseline. And that is just likely to exceed. That doesn't mean it's going to be stuck there. It'll be higher than that. So that's the trajectory we're on. It is very, very obvious that human activities related to the use of fossil fuels are exacerbating changes in climate and extreme weather. So, given that reality, what's the probability that the world will address in any meaningful way a reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases going forward? And this is a very important question to answer, because if the answer is we're not going to do it, we need to get on to adaptation very, very rapidly. And by the way, now we just get even more depressing. But anyhow. So what this figure shows, and this is from the International Energy Agency, which is the authoritative body in the world that documents the use of energy around the world, where it comes from, where it's going to, and what projections look like for energy usage going forward. And what we see here is from the graph you're looking at is world energy use from 1980 up to 2030. So right now, we're at 2014, so where this vertical line is. And what you can see, in reference to world energy supply at this moment, approximately 80% of world energy supply right now comes from about a third coal, oil, and natural gas. That's where we get energy in the world right now. 80% of world energy supply is coal, oil, natural gas. Renewables, biomass, hydro, nuclear, they contribute very small amount to world energy supply. If we project out to 2030, so not that many years from now, assuming optimistic scenarios on conservation, the use of renewables, and non-fossil fuel-based sources, what does world energy supply look like? What is the system locked into, the world's infrastructure? If we go out to 2030, we still have 80% of world energy supply, or thereabout, comes from a third coal, oil, and natural gas, but the carbon footprint on the planet will be much, much higher, because by 2030, absolutely for sure, there will be another 1.5 billion people on the planet. So right now we have 7.1 billion people on the planet. By 2030, we will add another 1.5 billion people. And this is material because when you think about it, from time zero, the time of Christ, till 1930, it took more or less 2,000 years to put 2 billion people on this planet. There were 250 million people on the planet at the time of Christ, assuming you believe in that, but that's a different topic. There are 250 million people on the planet at time zero, and it took nearly, in other words, the planet was more or less empty, and it took about 2,000 years to come up to 2 billion people on the planet. Since 1930 to now, we've added 5 billion people. So 2.5 times as many people over an 80-year period as what took 2,000 years have been added since 1930, and we've got another 1.5 billion people coming onto the planet. So the reality is our greenhouse gas emissions future is locked in. This is not a scenario I like. I'm just saying that's the reality. That's the infrastructure in the world. If you look at China, India, other major countries around the world, that's the infrastructure we're locked into. So we have to live with it. And we know for sure that the burning of fossil fuels is causing climate change and exacerbated extreme weather events. So the question becomes, what do we do about it? And just to drive the point home and beat the point to death, what you're looking at here is changes in global mean temperature from the period of 1880 till 2020 or so. And you can see that the mean temperature is shown here globally, but that for the first half of this time period, the average temperature on the planet was below the mean for the last 120 or 30 years. And now you see that we've gone over the mean. And you can see that that's coincident with CO2 level concentrations increasing as a function of time. Even this chart is not up to date. We're now over 400 parts per million, and we're going to continue to go. If you took this line and extended it out here across the harbor, it would have been at about 285 parts per million for the last million years and even longer. So that's the reality that we're locked into. I'm not saying I like that reality. I'm just saying that's the reality. It's like Senator Moynihan used to say in New York State. I always liked him. He said when people didn't like what they were seeing and so forth, he said, you know, you have a right to your own opinion, but you don't have a right to your own facts, and these are the facts. So having said that, I want to turn channels quickly here to talk just a little bit about the work I'm doing with the insurance sector. And the insurance sector is getting, as we'll hear, getting hit very, very hard, particularly in Canada, but all over the world, in reference to extreme weather events. It turned out that if you went back about 20 years ago in Canada, the big payout for property and casualty insurance in Canada, in other words, home insurance, was damage due to fires, houses burning. But starting about 20 years ago, fire as a percentage of payout on claims went way down, not because we got that much better at handling fires, but we did, but it went down as a percentage of payout because damage due to water, and particularly flooding and flooding basements, went up hugely. So water and flooding in basements is the new fire in the property and casualty insurance sector. So the insurance companies are acutely aware of this, and I work with an awful lot of them to develop plans to figure out how can we build adaptation into the Canadian system. One project that I'm not going to talk about here, but I will mention, was fully funded with Intact Financial, and now fully funded again for another 3 years. And Intact, if you don't know, Intact is the largest in property casualty insurer in Canada by a very large margin. They have about 18% of the market. With Intact, we've developed a project that's ongoing right now to identify what are our key priorities that we need to address as a country from an adaptation to climate change perspective. In other words, if you put everything on the table, all the different industry sectors, mining, forestry, petroleum, utilities, hospitality, telecommunications, financial services, alongside public sector areas such as Aboriginal First Nations impacts, biodiversity impacts, coastal erosion factors, how do you prioritize it down to the key areas that need to be addressed immediately, that are in most dire need of being addressed from an adaptation perspective? That's what this project did, and we have about 100 people around across Canada involved in this, and we brought it down to that the number one area for focus right now immediately was city infrastructure and adaptation. Now what we're doing in response to this is, in short form, we're running adaptation projects, on the ground operationalization of adaptation project, building bioswales, riparian buffer zones, permeable surface parking lots, things like that, in 5 Canadian cities: Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver, and monitoring these developments we're putting in place over time to calculate the return on investment for the adaptation initiative. So in other words, if you say, if we built a bioswale for $100,000, there's a way to set it up, which we're doing with a proper control experimental design, that we can say during the next high-intensity duration rainfall event, as a result of water going into that bioswale and not ending up in basements or storefront properties, that $100,000 investment just produced a $4.5 million return in avoided costs, that kind of thing. And I spend a huge amount of time in this country right now, and I'm still on this roadshow meeting with the senior-most people in the federal government of Canada, various premiers, deputy ministers, you name it, ministers, and mayors and councillors across the country that are very much into the flood file. And one of the things they want to know is what's the return on investment for adaptation initiatives. So you have to have those numbers, so that's what we're doing. The second report, and I'm just going to briefly refer to some of the findings of it, focuses on this. And indeed, as a matter of fact, I was very happy to see in the budget of a day or two ago that they actually, the minister quoted directly from the report in reference to the need for Canada to address overland flood insurance. So that was good. I'm surprised he actually took the exact words, and he didn't change a little bit to make himself look like he thought it all up himself, but that's a different topic as well. But the focus of this report was very straightforward. As you probably know, Canada is the only country of the G8 countries that doesn't offer overland flood insurance. And overland flood is flooding that would occur if your basement flooded and the water came up through the drain in the basement, flooded your basement. You can buy insurance coverage for that. You can get covered for that. But if the local stream overflowed and the water came through the side window of your house and flooded your basement, that's called overland flooding. You can't buy insurance for that. And it turns out, as my colleagues will tell you, that with major floods in Toronto, Calgary, and elsewhere around the country, when people's basements are flooded, the water ends up there, and they've been paying premiums for 25 years, and then an insurance adjuster comes in and says, oh, by the way, no, you're not covered because the water came through the window, that's overland flooding, you're not covered. That doesn't fly very well. So what we have to do is figure out what do we do from the perspective of addressing this void in the marketplace of no overland flood insurance. And so we went out and interviewed the presidents and CEOs of the largest 15 property and casualty insurance companies in Canada, and this is through a program supported by cooperators. And we said, if you were to offer overland flood insurance, what conditions would have to be met? It's not saying you're going to do it. It's just saying, if you were to offer overland flood insurance, what conditions would have to be met? And that's what this report documented, just what would have to be met if indeed we were even going to offer such insurance in the future. Now, I want to show you a couple of key findings from this because they very much pertain to how do we address adaptation to climate change, in particular to flooding in Canada. So this is what we're trying to avoid: flooded basements, infrastructure built such that water's backing up through sewer systems, overwhelming the system, flooding systems. What do we do in reference to physical infrastructure that's built on floodplains? What do we do within cities? You're not near a floodplain, but you're going to be flooded out en masse, and you've now got a home that you put all your life savings into that's worthless. How do we avoid this? And as I mentioned, for extreme weather events in Canada, things are getting worse in terms of payouts, particularly from the perspective of insurers. And by the way, it's not just insurers or people. At the end of the day, you pay into this stuff. Without insurance, we don't have a housing market. So we've got to get this right. But if you just look at claims, and this is for insurable losses for catastrophic events over time, and this is data I stole from IBC, so hopefully you just close your eyes at this point. If you go from 1983 up to 2013, and this number is now low, it'll go up to about 3.5 billion, you can see the amount of money paid out on claims for catastrophic loss events. These are events of $5 million and greater over time, and you can see it's getting worse as a function of time. It doesn't take too much to see that. And indeed, if you put a regression line through there, it's going up at a rate of about 30% overall. And for the insurance sector, this is also particularly problematic because for 9 of the last 11 years in Canada, the amount of money coming in the door through premiums has been less than the amount of money being paid out in claims. So for 9 of 11 years, P&C has lost money in Canada in reference to the money going in claims isn't jiving with that which is coming in premiums. And there, you want to use the word sustainable, that's not sustainable. And if we don't fix that, not only does it mean we'll have an uninsurable housing market in key sectors of the countries, it also means a collapse of the mortgage market. Because to qualify for a mortgage, you need house insurance. If you don't have house insurance, there's no mortgage market. The people that aren't involved in this equation yet that need to get involved very, very rapidly at a high level are the 5 major banks and the credit unions. They're still kind of sitting on the sidelines, not realizing what the threat is to their business right now from this perspective. So we asked, and then I'm almost done, so that's a cue for I'm going to stop talking in a minute. So what were a few of the key findings we found when we interviewed the presidents and CEOs? We would make a statement and say, how do you respond? And these 16 presidents and CEOs control 60% of the property and casualty insurance market in Canada. So this is the voice. We said, climate change will cause a material future change in the frequency and magnitude of overland flooding in my company's insurance market. Everybody agreed or strongly agreed. So that certainly is their view. We said the following, or we asked the following: is floodplain mapping sufficiently understood in the regions identified that underwriting risk exposure due to flooding can be adequately calculated? Yes, no, don't know. And you can see for Eastern Canada, Central, Western, and Northern Canada, it was consistently floodplain maps are out of date. No, 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 no. Not only are they out of date, by the way, for the high intensity duration rainfall events we're currently experiencing, but they're out of date relative to that which we will experience in the future. So we need up-to-date floodplain maps to give us an indication of where not to build. What are the areas to avoid? But it's not just what you avoid today. When you're building infrastructure that has zero capital stock turnover in human terms, and it's there 25, 50, or 75 years from now, you have to anticipate what's the floodplain going to be in that area 25, 50, 60 years down the road. So you've got to build it right in the first place in terms of location. And this seems highly, highly logical that you would do this, but I can tell you after being in front of innumerable mayors and councillors who aren't coming to this conference, that there have been times that I've been presenting this point and thought I'm going to be very lucky to get out of this room to my car in one piece. They do not like it when you walk into their town and say, we need to do up-to-date floodplain maps because you may red tag a zone that they're planning on building 3,000 houses. And all of a sudden they said, you know what? You've now put a stigma on us. We can't build houses there, and we're going to now lose the property tax revenue base that could have been realized from those houses. And by the way, I don't believe your floodplains. You've never seen water here, and we don't think it's ever going to come. And that's the reaction you get more often than not. Or if you've got houses or infrastructure in existing areas where you've now red tagged those, you get somebody coming along who owns $1 million home in an area that now has been labeled as a floodplain, and they will come after you with a gun if you don't figure out how to fix the system because they've said you've now devalued my property down to nothing. And there is a way to address these issues. Almost finally, floodplain insurance to be profitable for your company. For floodplain insurance to be profitable for your company, infrastructure under the direction of government control would have to be substantially flood hardened relative to its current condition. The answer is strongly agree, and a few disagreed. I don't know why. But anyhow, So there's no question about it. We have to weather harden the infrastructure within cities to not only offer overland flood insurance. One of the things that emerged from this is all the things you would have to do to offer overland flood insurance are exactly the same things you have to do and get better at very, very rapidly to continue to offer current insurance coverage for just standard sewer backup and so forth and flooding basements. So the answers to the questions, although they were originally presented with the context overland flooding, to address overland flooding, you have to also engage activities that will benefit the longevity of the current insurance market. Then finally, if provided with overland flood insurance, the average homeowner will initiate and maintain actions to limit the probability of flooding around his or her home, moving downspouts away from the house, ensuring outside sewer grates are clear, elevating electrical equipment off the basement floor. You see we had a bimodal distribution here. Some agreed and a lot disagreed. And this introduces the issue of moral hazard, i.e. the idea is that, well, now you've got insurance, so what do you care? It's a lamentable reality, but that does exist. So what we need to do here is educate homeowners on actions they can take in and around their home to de-risk the home from the probability of flooding. And what we need to do in this regard now, and this is an area I'm focused on quite a bit, we need to launch a home adaptation audit program in Canada. Much like we had the home energy audit program, we need a home adaptation audit program in Canada where someone can come into your house, 2.5 hours, they look around, they give you 10 things you can do for virtually no money, a little bit of labor, and it's very much the difference between your basement flooding or not during the next big storm. So we need to get on this. So this is quite solvable. Finally, on this I won't go into at all, I'm just going to mention it. From the corporate world, and this is where I spent my last 25 years in developing sustainable development programs for multinational corporations in mining, forestry, petroleum, utility. Transportation, mining, I've put a few pictures here, electricity, commercial real estate, whatever that is, forestry. Right now in the industrial world, in the business world, in the corporate world, we have next to no idea what our key vulnerabilities are from an extreme weather perspective in reference to running our businesses. There's huge threats there. We don't know what they are. We know they're probably real, but nobody has gone through and identified, give me the top 10 list of things I need to worry about if I'm running smelters, if I'm running rail lines, if I'm running a forestry operation, telecommunications, what are they? Nobody's done this work. There's a huge amount of risk sitting in the system right now that nobody knows about. But it won't take too long. I can guarantee you that the major pension funds are going to start focusing on this stuff. You're going to see Teachers Hoop, Case to Depot, Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, et cetera. They're going to start asking questions of companies, what are you doing to de-risk or lower your probability of extreme weather events affecting your business continuity, because that's risk for us as investors. We need to get the pension funds involved on this file. So this is it. Conclusion. To advance flood resiliency, we need to develop up-to-date floodplain maps for Canada. We need to weather harden municipal and suburban infrastructure, physical and natural. We need to weather harden houses. We need to bring the national building codes up to date to take into account extreme weather events. And we need to launch a home adaptation audit program. And not adapting to extreme weather is a bet we cannot afford to lose. And Warren Buffett said this, so you're in good company. So thank you very much.
I don't know about you, but I kind of wish that we'd asked FCM to set up an open bar here while we listen to Blair's presentation. Thank you very much, Blair, for that. I'm going to, we're going to save questions till the end of the session. We've tried to design it so there'll be about 15 minutes for conversation, questions, and discussion at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our next speaker. Chris White is the Vice President of Federal Affairs with the Insurance Bureau of Canada. He has over 20 years' experience in public and government relations and in strategic communications, planning both in the public and private sectors. Prior to joining IBC, he worked as Chief of Staff for 5 federal cabinet ministers, and he's going to speak on some of the important work that IBC has been doing to support climate adaptation in Canadian municipalities. Welcome, Chris.
They were Liberal cabinet ministers, and if I was still really partisan, I would say that watching Jim Flaherty, Stephen Harper, and Jason Kenney try and figure out income splitting is a good thing. But I'm not partisan any longer. It's always tough to speak before lunch because people always are hungry, but it's even worse today given that the hockey game's starting at noon, so I won't tell you the score. Thank you for the invitation to be here this morning. From our perspective, as you can appreciate, this is an issue that is really, the industry is really grappling with it, and as Blair alluded to, they know what's at stake, but they don't necessarily have a handle on it. And increasingly, when you look at what the industry is paying out, last year, for example, in 2013, it was the worst year on record with payouts over $3 billion. For the last 5 years, it was $1 billion, and this past year was $3.2 billion. And there's no indication that that isn't going to become the norm. And when people consistently say what used to be a 1 in 100 year event or a 1 in 150 year event, well, that is becoming the new norm, and that's a real problem for the industry. So I'll walk you through my remarks. Some of them, some of the points that Blair has made, there's a certain commonality to them, but I think that the common thread in all of this is it's incumbent on all levels of government to get a handle on this and to be much more engaged on the files that they have been. And, for example, when you look at when Obama spoke last week in the State of the Union, and he spoke about climate change, and he said it's a fact. There's no longer an argument. Well, that's the kind of leadership that we need to have in Canada. And I think there were some measures taken in the budget that are certainly encouraging, but there's a lot more that needs to be done that this government and certainly all governments at all levels need to really engage in. Is there a clicker or? Thank you. When you look back to, and it's interesting, for example, when you look at PEI in 2009 when Hurricane Juan hit, you talk to people who were here at the time, and there certainly was a sense that it was a storm like every other storm that we've ever had. So some people were really worried. Some people thought, well, it's not that big of a deal. But the reality is it was a defining moment for the province. It was a defining moment for many islanders. But from that event, there have come, and you will see substantive changes in terms of how people begin to prepare and what the government has done. And I think it's a bit of a roadmap for what other provinces have done, and I'm sure when we hear from the other panelists in terms of what the lessons learned from Calgary, you're beginning to see a pattern that these storms and these events are happening with such great frequency that people are now learning lessons that they can all apply to various provinces across the country. So trees were down, 100-year-old trees uprooted quite easily, power's out across the province. And again, most people never anticipated that the storm would have such ferocity. But the reality is it did. And as a consequence, when you look at what's happened going forward, the Provincial Department of Public Safety has now got measures taken in place where if storms are coming, so now the Office of Public Safety has in place mobile phone alerts, and people are now apprised, and they track these storms with much more vigilance than they had in the past, and they have a much greater sense of what the scope of these storms might be like. But from the perspective of a resident of PEI, you no longer take for granted that it's just a tropical storm because you don't know what it's going to be like. What you do know, though, is that it has happened, it's going to happen again, and there's every chance it could have much more ferocity than it did in the past. So as a consequence, people have changed, people have begun to adapt, and the government provincially and some of the townships have adapted as well, which is important and it's critical, right, in terms of a going forward process. So when we talk about these issues from an industry perspective, and certainly my job in Ottawa when I talk to government, is it's no longer a question of are they going to happen, it's a question of when will they happen next, and to what degree and what severity will they be. And clearly government at the federal level is not ready for them. And even, for example, we deal a lot with public safety, and it's interesting because, to Blair's comments about flood mapping, well, they've just got an RFP that they put out recently. The most recent flood mapping that Canada has had was 1992. So some things have changed since 92, as you might appreciate. But then what's also interesting and what's also discouraging is I was at a conference about 2 weeks ago, and I was giving some remarks, and a fellow came up to me from the National Research Council and said, well, that's great that you're doing flood mapping. We're doing flood mapping. And I said, well, have you spoken to public safety? And he said, well, why would I speak to public safety? And I said, well, they're doing flood mapping. And he said, well, we had no idea that they were doing flood mapping. So, you know, there's so many jokes you could make, but it's not funny, right? It's just not funny. And as a taxpayer, it's not funny. The encouraging thing, though, is that from a flood mapping perspective, the government has begun to realize that they need to get proper flood mapping done. And that's something, even within the Insurance Bureau of Canada, we've begun to look at, and we're looking at partnering with both public safety. And we actually had a call yesterday with the National Research Council to get a sense of what they were doing and whether or not we could work with them. So, you know, there is very modest progress, and there is very modest recognition that government has to do more. But, you know, the challenge is there is, in Ottawa, there's a very siloed mentality, and there's also a very clear sense that because this government perhaps has not been as supportive and as progressive as, you know, I think a lot of us would think that they should have been, you've got a lot of public servants who are very timid about really trying to advance a file that they know intuitively they need to be advancing. And some people would say, well, why, for example, would flood mapping be the purview of public safety? Why wouldn't it be at Environment Canada or Natural Resources Canada? Well, the reality is that this government puts more stock in what officials of public safety would say than they do at Environment or NRCan, which is a whole other session, as Blair was alluding to, which is not one we'll get into today. But in 2015, this, I think, will be one of those issues that will be a very significant public policy debate in the election, because you have two parties that are going to hammer the government on their record. And with so much increased attention to natural catastrophes and to storms and to weather, it's going to be really hard, I think, for the government to hide from their record. And I don't mean to sound overly partisan, because certainly when the Liberals were in power, you know, there's a lot that the government at that time could have done that they didn't do in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation. So every government has a responsibility, and every government has not done what they should have done. Blair alluded to the panel they reported last year, and some of the things that the IPCC referenced: more extreme weather events, both more frequent and more intense. Well, I mean, that's evident, and you've seen that in almost every province, unfortunately. We also, in 2012, commissioned a report telling the weather story by Dr. Gordon McBain, who's a Nobel laureate, teaches at the University of Western Ontario. Terrific report, and again, what he said really won't come as much of a surprise, but essentially, we know the climate is changing. We know that weather patterns are changing. We know that there's going to be more rain, more hail, more fires. And in the next 40 years, so he looked at it from 2010 to 2050, but the message to government is that unless you start to invest, when you do finally begin to invest, it could potentially be too late, because the social and economic costs right now, which are very, very high, they're not trending down. They're just going to continue to trend up. So at some point, government has to say, we get it, we're going to invest. It's going to cost money. There's no doubt about that. But the money that you spend today is going to be what you need to spend, because if you don't invest today, it's going to be more substantial and more significant. So it's always interesting when governments say, well, we're cutting taxes and we're doing this. But what they're not telling you, and what they're not, it's disingenuous, right? Because the cost for my children and my grandchildren is going to be that much more significant, not just from the degradation of the planet, but just from the monies that eventually they will have to pay. So there has to be movement, and there has to be action. And certainly from an industry perspective, as Blair alluded to, the industry is losing money. And I am I'm not an insurance agent. I've only been in the industry 2 years, and I think my rates are too high. But, you know, I think when I see the numbers, it is true that the industry is losing money. And at some point, the industry is going to say to government, unless you do something, we're going to leave. And if we leave, then you do have a problem with the housing market. You do have a problem with the mortgage market. And then what people often forget is it's the domino effect. So while I may think that this storm that hit Calgary only affected Calgarians, well, the reality is that the money that the federal government just paid out about last fall, upwards of $2 billion, well, they didn't have a $2 billion envelope just waiting to pay out for a Calgary flood, just waiting for that to happen. they had to go into the Consolidated Revenue Fund, and they had to take out money that every taxpayer contributes to. So every incident that happens in Canada, every Canadian taxpayer is paying for. So every effort that is not undertaken at mitigation or adaptation is a tax cost to Canadians, and they're going to get worse. And that's unfortunately the reality, and that's the challenge and the frustration we have in Ottawa, which is they get it, they will acknowledge it really late at night when there's no lights on, and they're sure no one else is listening, but they know what they need to do, but they're not prepared to do it right now for all sorts of political and economic reasons. And that's increasingly becoming untenable, because we know that these incidents, as I say, are going to continue to happen. These are pictures that you've likely all seen from Calgary, and I'm sure Redford is doing that a lot these days. I think that's what she looked like when she got back from South Africa after spending $45,000. I thought it was only 40, she said. So when you look at what's happened, for example, just at the beginning of this year, you've had the polar vortex. You had, I can't even understand what happened at Atlanta with kids being kept overnight because they had, I think, 2 inches of snow, and then that's just shocking. Enough said on that one, I think. You had the forest fires raging in Australia. You had a high of, that's 52, but that day got higher in Alaska, closing ski slopes. Sounds a bit like Sochi this week. And then you had drought in California, which was apparently the worst in over a century, and this was actually their rainy season. So the question becomes, I think for all of us, can we honestly say that we have done enough on this issue? And has government gone far enough? And I think obviously the answer is no. Last fall, some of you may be familiar with the think tank, the independent think tank in Ottawa. It's Ottawa-based. It's called Canada 2020. What they do is they bring together decision makers and high-level public policy makers, and it's a really interesting process. They usually have it once every 3 months, and they attract some really, really thoughtful speakers. So last fall, they did a panel on climate change, and what they were asking for, or asking I should say, is what would you do? Would you pay more to get a handle on this issue? And one of the leading researchers, and the Vice President of Canada 2020, some of you may know, she still is, but she's now overseas with her husband, Diana Carney. And Diana is a huge proponent of what government should be doing and what Canadians should be doing on climate change. And it's really interesting when you hear former Governor Carney speak and his wife speak, you can see that she has really influenced his thinking on these issues. And we had a meeting with the governor in the summer of 2012 at IBC, and we went to speak to him about a range of issues. But the one issue that really, aside from the economics, the one issue that really captured his imagination was the vulnerability that Canada has to earthquakes. Because we were sitting in the offices of the Bank of Canada, and we couldn't go in the front door that day because they wanted to repair from the earthquake that had rattled Ottawa in 2011. And what his perspective was, and what the industry's perspective is, when you look at, for example, earthquakes, Canada is vulnerable on both the East Coast and the West Coast. But that day, his concern was what what could potentially happen to the GDP of Canada, because he was referencing what had happened in Christchurch, and the cost to the government had been about $5.5–6 billion. And when you tack that onto the GDP, it could talk. I think his number was about a 1.5 to 2.5% hit on the GDP. So when you consider that the Canadian economy is sluggish to best right now, you can imagine what that would take. And a significant earthquake on the east or west coast for a country that is clearly not prepared could certainly have enormous effects on the Canadian economy. So, it does resonate with senior decision makers, but again, they grapple with what and how to sort of approach it. What the results of their study did find, though, were that Canadians, more so than Americans, more concerned, more informed, more willing, and more demanding of government. So we know that Canadians want to do more. we know that government is struggling with how to do it and when to do it. We also know that it's not exclusive to any one level of government. For example, a year ago, the National Municipal Adaptation Project, multi-university research group, had some, I would say, sober news for Canadians. It surveyed 480 municipalities. 65% said they either didn't have or only at an early stage of discussing adaptation. And it's interesting, right? Because when you come to a conference like this, where you're dealing with municipal leaders, I'm always struck by how much they're doing. But when you look at it across the board, there's clearly a lot of work, a significant amount of work that has to be done. And of course, the challenge is that the federal government, when they reduce the transfers to the provinces, who then in turn reduce transfers to the municipalities, you know, there is a cost, and some things are going to be affected. And I made some brief remarks yesterday, but I think the concern right now is, while there were some investments made in the budget on Tuesday, there was also a line about from Flaherty, we need to look at addressing the DFAA, the Disaster Financial Assistance Accord, which dates back to 1970, which in 1970 the federal government was more than happy to pay 90 cents on a dollar to the provinces or municipalities when there were natural disasters. They're not so keen anymore because these things are happening with increased frequency, and they know that the 90 to 10 cents ratio is no longer a tenable structure for them. So that's in play, and then when you look at these numbers, that's going to be a concern. We at IBC have undertaken what we think is a useful tool. It's called the Municipal Risk Assessment Tool. As you know, municipalities have very limited funds, so when they do have monies to invest in infrastructure, and as some of you may know, Harper and Minister LaBelle are announcing later this afternoon the details to the infrastructure fund that they tabled last year. And there may be some, you know, investments that will be germane to what municipalities need and what provinces need in terms of, you know, upgrading the infrastructure that might have some benefits. But what we have been finding is, because so many people now have basements that are probably nicer than most of the apartments I lived in university, when they are flooded, they're destroyed, and the cost is in the tens of thousands of dollars, which is absurd. I live in this old house. It's about 120 years old, and I think I have this much space when I go down. And you know, that's what basements used to be like, but increasingly they're not. And as a consequence, what this tool tries to do is it identifies the sewers that are most susceptible to back up. It identifies how old the infrastructure is, so that if the municipality does have funds and is going to upgrade their infrastructure, upgrade the sewer mains, they know exactly where they need to target their limited resources. We've had 3 pilot projects underway: Coquitlam, Hamilton, and Fredericton, and a few others are certainly under consideration, but we need to get a better handle on what these results look like. But certainly the feedback so far from city engineers has been very, very positive. Blair alluded to some of the work that they're doing, improving energy efficiency to increase the use of alternative and renewable energy, and using supplementary cementing materials such as fly ash to reduce the environmental footprints. And that's terrific, right? Because you need as many of these types of examples when you're dealing with decision makers in Ottawa to show them that there is a paper trail, that you're not asking them to reinvent something that has never been done. You're saying, this is being done and this is working. This is being done and this is working. What you need to do, either at the elected level or the non-elected level, is you need to go out, figure out then how that can apply at the federal level, and how you can then make that part of the public policy initiatives that the government has undertaken. In terms of the city of Calgary, as awful and devastating as the flood was last year, you know, I'm sure we're going to hear from it, the lessons learned, I think, will be invaluable. The one really interesting thing as a political person or former political staff will be Redford's commitment to rebuild on the floodplains this time, but not to rebuild if there's a flood that happens where they've rebuilt again. It's, you know, if she can stick to that, I think that is a game changer, because there are so many decisions made at the municipal level that are just so foolish. And of course, if you build on the side of a river, it's going to at some point flood. So it'd be really interesting that if, for example, close to the next election, and if the polls are closed and there's a flood, and those houses are washed out again, if she can hold to that. If she can hold to that, she may become like the mayor of Whistler, but at the same time, she will have done an invaluable service to all Canadians and all politicians. So, you know, I'll be interested to hear your comments, but I think, as I say, I think that has the potential to be a game changer. In terms of the budget, is the government assuming a leadership position? Well, no, right? And you know, I'm not being facetious and I'm not being overly partisan, but they're not. I mean, you know, it'd be disingenuous for me to say that they were. It's encouraging, though, for example, that there is a reference now to a national mitigation strategy that was in the budget. It's encouraging that they're going to look at earthquake standards to make sure that, or earthquake standards to make sure that we are at least thinking about it, because as I say, we're very, very vulnerable. But the reality is the $200 million, which is a first start, is essentially $40 million because it's over 5 years. How Ottawa works, though, for those of you who don't work in Ottawa, it works at a glacial speed in terms of public policy. So just even getting this in the budget was it's a strong signal. And in meetings that we've had with senior officials, both elected and non-elected, I would say candidly, they do get it. That they're not immune to this, right? I mean, they saw the devastation in Calgary, and those MPs from Toronto would say that Toronto was even far worse because Toronto is the center of the universe for everyone, as you know, and maybe that's why there's some progress, but just even the ice storm. So there is initiatives that are underway, and there are certainly, from the perspective of public safety and Minister Blaney, there's a lot of work that they need to do, but they really do need the support of the provinces and the municipalities. And when you look at the job grant proposal and how they're about to impose that on the provinces, you can see that this is, again, another example of one hand doesn't talk to the other, because if I'm a province and I want to work on this file, but yet at the same time the government is telling me what to do in terms of job training, I'm not necessarily as inclined. So there's a lot of things that go into the mix in this thing in terms of public policy at the federal level, but it's incumbent on all of us to keep the pressure up on them, because as I say, public safety has a bit of an opening, but there needs to be far more. And we do know, for example, that they've begun to do flood mapping. We also know that you know, they're going to cabinet this late winter, early spring with a memorandum to cabinet to really begin to do a lot more in this. But we also know that the number that they think, the dollars that they think are required, finance is saying there's no way. So, you know, it's going to be a very incremental evolution of this file, but it may go the other way, which is there'll be such a natural disaster, such horrific proportions, that the government will say, well, I can't believe that the Liberal government, when they were in power, didn't invest in this, but we will do this because we are the new government, as they like to tell us. So something's going to happen, right? It's either going to happen really incrementally, unfortunately, or it's going to happen really quickly, but that won't be good either, because that means something horrible has happened to Canada, which will have horrible human implications and will take a real toll on the Canadian economy. So, are we doing enough? Obviously not. And what we do need is a new call to action. And a colleague of mine gave me this quote just in terms of climate change. And I must say, growing up, I never thought I would ever quote Prince Charles, but I'm not a monarchist. But he said, calling climate change deniers the headless chicken brigade. And it's funny, but it's not, right? Much like some of the comments I made earlier. So I think, you know, my last point would be, from an industry's perspective, we need much more investment on the part of government, but we also need, you know, all policyholders to say to their local officials, their provincial representatives, and their federal representatives, you need to get your act together. It's not one level of government's responsibility. It's not one level of government's fault. You all need to figure this out, because if you don't, this isn't going to get better. It's going to get worse, and we're all going to be paying more premiums, or the economy is going to be hurt, or the human cost will be incalculable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And we're getting a little squeezed for time, so without any delay, I would like to invite Catherine Hodges, who's an environmental scientist and a project manager with the City of Calgary's River Flood Mitigation Program, She's going to share with us the hands-on experience, sort of where the rubber hits the road, if you will, in terms of challenges that Calgary's facing to build resilience in the aftermath of the 2013 flood. Welcome, Catherine.
Hi. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. I'm excited to be here to give Calgary's perspective. Environmental and climate change factors are influencing the frequency and magnitude of events on a worldwide basis. The nature and scale of events expected to impact the city of Calgary are changing and expanding. In June 2013, Calgary experienced the largest flood in living memory. According to a recent survey of Calgarians, 45% of Calgarians indicated that they had been impacted in some way, either being flooded themselves or housing someone who was flooded or not being able to attend work or take their child to daycare. Overland flooding affected residential homes, businesses, electrical facilities, and city infrastructure. Bonnybrook Wastewater Treatment Plant, as shown here, was inundated with water, resulting in significant damage to equipment. For several weeks, the plant was operating outside of the regulatory compliance requirements. This is an NMAX substation that was threatened during the flood. It provides electricity to south communities and a hospital. 80,000 people were evacuated in a 15-hour time period. The Calgary Fire Department performed 400 rescues, and the NMAX decided to conduct staged de-energizing of communities to ensure public safety throughout the flooding. 800 kilometers of roads were affected during the flood, including 20 bridges, 5 LRT stations, 93 pathways, and 3 parks. Transit modified routes in flood-affected areas, and most schools were closed for 6 days. The downtown core was closed for approximately 8 days. The Stampede grounds were fully inundated with water, and incredibly, 15 days after the flood, the Stampede kicked off with its annual parade. This is a community in Earlton, which is near the Stampede. It was actually designed to flood. It conveys floodwaters. Brian Pincott in the session this morning mentioned that our planning is only as good as our last flood. And so, in fact, it is true, we did have lessons learned from our 2005 flood. We implemented some mitigation measures after that event that really helped us during the 2013 event. For instance, during the 2013 flood, we maintained clean drinking water. That's because of upgrades that were made to the water treatment facility. So what can the city do to minimize the impact of future extreme weather events? What I want to talk to today is about I'll start with an overview of our watershed and how we prepare for flood events, what happened during the 2013 flood event, our recovery efforts, and what's next, how do we build resiliency. So Calgary sits east of the mountain area, so our watershed is primarily mountain region, which is basically rock and gravel. So when the water hits our watershed, it gets straight into the creeks and rivers and comes very quickly to Calgary. There's only a 9 to 12 hour leeway from when water hits Bragg Creek to when it hits Calgary. This means there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of flood forecasts, as well as we want to notify the public about these kinds of events, but there's the cry wolf phenomenon. What does the city do to prepare for floods? We have flood attenuation, flood mitigation, an excellent emergency response planning system, and monitoring and forecasting. As far as flood attenuation, we have, there are two rivers, Bow River and Elbow River in Calgary. On the Elbow, there's the Glenmore Reservoir, and it's actually built in 1932 for drought. It's so that in the fall and winter, we have drinking water supply. But we also use it for flood attenuation. We have developed guidelines on how far to draw down the level in the Glenmore prior to a rainfall event based on forecasted or predicted river flow. And there's a lot of uncertainty in our forecasts, as I mentioned. We have a lot of flood mitigation tools. There's flood walls that have been built in communities. There's these other things like sandbags and berms, water tubes, and then we have gates that are automated for stormwater outfalls. We have an amazing emergency response planning system, and the Calgary Emergency Management Association, our agency, is sort of takes the lead on flood response. So as you can see in this map, we have these amazing maps that are developed for 1 in 10 year, everything from a 5-year up to a 500-year event that shows where the water would where it'd go in the community. We also have icons. This is all built into a GIS system. So there's icons that show critical infrastructure, and you can click on it and get the contact information for that. So we build our evacuation plans around these inundation maps. We also have these maps for building barriers. So we know exactly, based on the level of river flow, where to go out to the community and build barriers. So there's different types of barriers that can be built. If we don't have enough sandbags, they can go to water tubes, or if there's not enough water tubes, they can use earth barrier. We also have a monitoring and forecasting system that's very well developed. We have staff, 100 technical staff on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from mid-May to mid-July, which is our high runoff time period. They look at the snowpack, what's happening to the snowpack in the mountains, and what's happening with the watershed precipitation. They also model what happened, sort of the level of the Glenmore Reservoir. So now I'm going to talk about the 2013 event. So you can see it was raining in Calgary, but it was pouring in the watershed. So there was a huge downpour west of Calgary. And I wanted to tell you that the Bow reached a 1 in 100-year peak flow rate, and the Elbow reached a 1 in 500-year flow rate. And those are unfortunate terms because I don't think it conveys the meaning behind it. It doesn't mean that it's going to be another 100 years before we have a 1 in 100-year event. It means that it's a probability of 1% chance each year of that scale of event happening. So this is another way of looking at it. So in 2013 on the Elbow River, we had a 1 in 500-year event. And this is downstream of the Glenmore Reservoir, so we were able to attenuate the river down to a 1 in 100-year event, which drastically changed the outcome and prevented a lot more flooding in the downtown core. This is a schematic showing the level event, size of event on the Bow River. So people do say that they've never seen this kind of event in their lifetime, which is true. But there was a blip back in the 1930s with some large events. But in fact, there's been larger events in the history. In the late 1800s, there were events larger than 2013's event. I really like this map because it shows some of our modeling. So the purple is where we modeled where a 1 in 100-year event where the water would go. But the yellow is where it ended up going. So we put in some mitigation measures that prevented some flooding in the downtown core. This area did not flood because we put a berm along the 4th Street community here. And then over here, this area is Inglewood, and it also did not flood because we put in a berm here. I'll get into the recovery efforts now. So there's been a lot of work done, and it's been very costly. There's a lot of erosion on the river banks that's been worked on. The debris had to be removed, outfalls. There's a lot of sediment in our storm and sanitary lines that had to be flushed out. As I mentioned, the NMAX building or substation and Bonnybrook wastewater treatment plant had suffered a lot of damage that had to be worked on. And there's also been a lot of impacts in terms of community health and wellness and businesses. 4,000 businesses were directly affected by the flood, and 25 remain closed, 12 of which are not expected to reopen. So the city is doing a lot of things in terms of working on infrastructure, looking at our planning. Part of the planning and assessment evaluation is looking at resurveying the river because it's completely changed course. Now, where there used to be river, there's now tons of gravel. We're also looking at our response and how to improve that. This just shows along the riverbed what's happened since June to November, the putting in the, correcting the whole area. And as far as cost, there is no certain figure for how much it'll cost, but a master list has been created of 185 infrastructure projects totaling $445 million. So what next? How do we improve our resiliency? And what did we learn from 2013 flood? So in July, the city decided to set up a river flood mitigation panel. While it's important to direct resources in rebuilding infrastructure and restoring services, the city does recognize that it's really got to invest in future disaster risk reduction. So we're collaborating with external stakeholders and the provincial government, and we're going to identify a list of projects that will increase the overall resiliency of our city. So as I mentioned, we set up this river flood mitigation program. It's with the expert management panel, and we're looking at mitigation recommendations for reducing impact of future flood events on the Calgary community. So the mandate is to put forward these recommendations to council for June this year. And this timing of this project is to tie into the budget planning cycle that we have for 2015 to 2018. These are our members of our expert management panel. Wolf Keller is the former director of water resources at the City of Calgary, but he's come back out of retirement, and he's the chair. So the program decided, because it's such a big issue and so many areas to consider, that we should divide it up into 6 theme areas to really touch on all of the concepts that we need to touch on. For each theme, we've assembled teams of about 6 subject matter experts from across Canada. So there are questions within each theme that we are trying to address with our groups. There's climate change, event forecasting, and watershed. That's basically the science behind these type of events. Storage, diversion, and protection is a theme panel that's looking at the civil engineering projects that we can take on or that are feasible. Berms, dikes, looking at upgrades to lift stations. And we're also in that group looking at a feasibility study on the Glenmore Reservoir bypass. And the last 2 themes are infrastructure and property resiliency, how we can build resiliency into our buildings and homes in our community. And then additional risk is everything else. No matter what you do, you can't prevent a flood event. So what do you do beyond that in terms of insurance? What other considerations do we have to have? So I'm a project manager on the last two themes here. And there's a project manager for the storage diversion project, and then there's a project manager for the other three here. So what are we doing currently with the program? What are we considering? We are looking at options to increase Glenmore Reservoir storage. There's been ideas of dredging the Glenmore Reservoir or increasing the height of the dam. Sunnyside was a community that was hit hard by the flood, so we're looking at drainage improvement studies there. And we're looking at reviewing the impact of that berm that I mentioned earlier on 4th Street. So what does it all cost? Well, one of the projects, we don't know, basically, is the question. The Glenmore Reservoir Diversion Project has been come in at $200 to $300 million. Who knows if that's enough? The Bonnybrook flood protection we're proposing is $60 million. This shows the diversion bypass we're considering from the Glenmore Reservoir straight out to the Bow River, essentially preventing the floodwaters from getting downtown to the north and just having them go straight out to the Bow. And those are three different alignments that we're considering. What else are we considering? Well, how to manage existing development in the floodway and flood fringe. So one of the first things people suggest to us is why are people living in the floodway or flood fringe? Make room for the river, right? It makes sense, except that the downtown core is in the flood fringe. So it's a little bit difficult to move these huge, heavy, high-rise buildings. One of our expert panelists suggested the concept of managed retreat or mandatory buyouts. We are also looking at changing land use bylaws and building regulations. So we're looking at, in terms of building resiliency in the individual and community, we want to empower citizens by giving them information they need on flood proofing, also by possibly putting some of these flood maps online. And we want to improve our notification system, so there are talks about creating an application for a phone or better improving the system that we have in place. And there's talks of sponsoring a flood exhibition. We also are looking at ways to improve our infrastructure resiliency, such as raising bridges that were affected and flood-proofing critical infrastructure like the Bonnybrook wastewater treatment plant, and maybe moving the outfall location at that plant. We ask in our panels, is the 1 in 100 year standard appropriate? It's a minimum in Canada. In fact, it's I think 1 in 500 or 1 in 200 years standard in BC, and in other countries it's 1 in, or even in Winnipeg, I think it's different. So we're having that conversation. And we're also thinking big picture, like within the organization as a city, whether or not we need to have something like an Office of Resiliency so that we integrate resiliency into our processes. Almost like triple bottom line, where it's underlying theme in everything that we do. Something I didn't mention is that our citizens and community really demonstrated great resiliency and community spirit. A few days after the flood, when we had a volunteer drive at McMahon Stadium to assist those who were impacted by the flood, we needed 600 volunteers and we had 6,000 turn up. So we really want to empower the citizens further and harness that energy and get them prepared. So we don't have all the answers at this point, but I like the analogy of the Rubik's Cube. There are a lot of variables and solutions to consider, and it'll really come down to what combination of solutions makes the most sense economically, socially, and environmentally. Thanks for your time.
I know we're just running into the beginning of lunch now. I still see a lot of faces here, which is really encouraging. I'm sure there are a few questions in the audience, so If your stomach can handle it, I hope that you'll stay for a few minutes and take advantage of the experience that we have up here at the front of the room. So with that, I'd like to invite anyone with questions to approach the mic.
Hi, Greg Kriske, Mayor of the City of Leduc in Alberta. Very good presentations, very interesting. It seems that municipalities, if we're going to do the right things, bear the costs, and our particular citizens bear the costs. Those municipalities who don't do anything, don't do the right thing, will benefit from provincial or federal funds in the event something happens. So although we can do the right thing, we're the ones that take the flack if we do the right thing, and our citizens pay for it. Is there any thought from the insurance industry that if municipalities do the right thing and take the proper measures, that the insurance industry would declare that our community is more disaster-proof or ready, so there would be a across-the-board cut in insurance rates for the citizens? Because at least then we could justify it to our communities.
My initial sense is no, but it's interesting you raise it because I know, for example, they've done that in some jurisdictions down in the United States and in some of the European jurisdictions as well. So I think increasingly as the industry's losses continue to rise, I think considerations like that will have to be part of the discussion process. But the short answer is I mean, maybe Blair, you might have some thoughts, but I haven't seen anything, and I'm relatively new to the industry, but certainly that's not been my sense. But I do know from a public policy perspective that there are a lot more consideration now given to thoughts like that historically have never even been part of it, right? Because it has always been, well, you're doing the right thing because you're doing the right thing, so why should we pat you on the back? Well, the reality is you're doing the right thing, but there's a political cost to doing the right thing. And as a consequence, there has to be, I would hope, that the industry would find some nimbleness that has not historically been there. I don't want to lose my job, so I won't go further than that. But I would say that there is probably an openness that is overdue, but there needs to be, and there will be, I think, consideration going forward, I would hope.
I can answer it more forthrightly because I'm in a position nobody can fire me. And if they fire me, I'll go do something else. But so I'll answer your question in reference to one insurer that has answered this question very directly, because I've been on a roadshow with cooperators, and we've been traveling around the country meeting with people federally, provincially, municipally, and so forth. Mayors, councillors, ministers, and so forth. And your question always comes up. Every meeting, that question comes up. And the answer so it is correct to say that the insurance sector has not stepped up to the plate to date. But going forward, for sure, cooperators, I can tell you, their response is that they will look at your city or cities that get ahead of the curve on the file in reference to giving lower insurance premiums, lower deductibles, and maybe even some sort of supportive type structure for initiatives engaged to put a backwater valve in place. So they recognize very much that they've got to step up to the plate and put skin in the game here to recognize best practices. So for cities to be insurable going forward and to label themselves as such, those efforts will increasingly so be rewarded by, well, for sure, cooperators. And I can almost tell you for many of the, several of the other large insurers I work with who haven't stated it publicly, so I won't give their names, but they're in that camp as well. So I hope you don't mind if I just slightly deviate. Yeah. For sure, your efforts will be recognized.
Thanks. Kim Richter from Township of Langley in British Columbia. I have 4 questions. Hopefully they're really like quick answer questions. It was just from the notes that I took through the meeting here. Blair, you mentioned that Canada is the only G8 country that doesn't offer overland flooding insurance. My question is why?
I'll give the quick answer is historically it's not been an issue in Canada in terms of extreme weather events and flooding as it has in other G8 countries. So there's a new stress in the system that wasn't here in any measurable or material way in an earlier domain. So we've got a new stress, and now we've got to get on this file.
Okay, so are there lessons we can learn from other countries about getting this coverage in?
The answer is yes, but they're limited. And Don Forgeron, who you know well, who's the president of IBC, one of the points he makes all the time is yes, the other G8 countries are offering overland flood insurance, but the system works incredibly poorly. So just because others have it doesn't mean it's working well. The big problem with overland flood insurance is for the current insurance that's being offered at this moment, just current coverage, it's a money loser. So a lot of the insurers don't get too excited about putting another product out there that's going to be an even bigger money loser. But not doing it is not an option, because if you don't, government will impose it on you, and you'll end up with a system that is less desirable than the one you could develop yourself.
Okay. And Blair, you also mentioned that 9 of 11 years money coming in through premiums is less than the money going out through premiums or through claims, and this is unsustainable. How soon could we see changes coming? Because it is unsustainable.
Well,
Are we already seeing
the
it?
premiums are going up now, and
Yeah.
you've seen the announcement. So this is, for example, Intact made an announcement the other day that their premiums are going up 15–20%. But the problem is, with the risk in the system, you can't price risk indefinitely, i.e. somebody paying, let's say, $1,200 a year property and casualty insurance premiums may go to $9,000. In other words, it becomes unaffordable. So the only alternative in the system is to de-risk the system, because you cannot price it at the level required to cover the costs. People can't afford it. It won't happen. Therefore, you have to get the risk out of the system.
Okay. You also mentioned that this could potentially lead to a collapse in the housing and mortgage markets.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, has the insurance industry put together any kind of area maps of housing developments that aren't going to be insurable in the future?
To a limited extent. There are areas now that we will walk into south of, well, you can answer this question better than I can, south of Calgary, where we'll say those areas we're not going to offer insurance anymore. It's just too risky. It can't be done.
Okay.
Yeah, so it is happening, and it's
It
going to happen more so.
It is happening. Okay, and that leads to my last question, which I think is directed to Chris. You mentioned your municipal risk assessment tool. Is that part of what you would do as part of this tool, to tell us what houses aren't going to be insurable? And also, I wanted to know if there was a cost associated to municipalities if they took advantage of using the tool.
So right now, there is no cost to municipalities to use the tool, and the data that is collected is retained by the city. In terms of what houses might be deemed uninsurable, that's not the intent of the tool. The tool is to help the municipalities identify what parts of the city are most susceptible and where the infrastructure investments, if they do get monies to invest, is most needed.
Just before the next question, I just want to draw your attention to the screen here. You'll see we're doing the evaluation of the session, and I'm thinking for expediency, if we can do it concurrent with the remaining questions, that would be great. I know there's more than 20 people in the room, so if we could, if you're sitting at a table and you've got one of those clickers, if you could do that now, that would be helpful. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, Mark Brostrom from the City of Edmonton. I work in our Office of Environment. Just a question, and this is more a fundamental or foundational or question around awareness, trying to get attention of both at the political level, but even at the public level. And it's just something we're trying to figure out how to communicate this risk and this challenge. On one side, we see lots of events happening, but we're trying to communicate it in a way, it seems, as far as a future risk. We're using, and there's a bit of a cognitive disconnect here for me. And I'll take the weather out here today. We're talking about weather, and we're going to have between yesterday and tomorrow, we're going to have a 30-degree change in temperature. So we talk about that weather, and then and so we're using degrees C. And then we say, okay, well, we're going to have a 2-degree change in global temperature, and that's going to be significant. It's going to be a major challenge. We talk about it might go to 4 degrees, and that's going to be catastrophic. And if we go to 6 degrees, that's going to be risk to the species type events. Yet, in the same, we might be saying in the same, and by the way, tomorrow the weather's going to be 20 degrees warmer than it is today. So, any thoughts on how we might best communicate, market, sort of get that message out there that that's significant in maybe a different way, or connecting that somehow to try to get that piece, because I think a lot of people are challenged with that, including myself at times.
Any takers for comment on that?
And I've joked at times, but actually it's not a joke. It's we need to bring creative thinking to the equation to address these types of issues. And I've often said that, for example, and the answer maybe is with a Tim Hortons equivalent, i.e., there's some really smart person somewhere in Tim Hortons has figured out a way to influence people to line up for 25 cars deep and wait half an hour to buy mediocre coffee in Timbits. And they do it, and it works. So the question is, how do you take that kind of creativity and apply it to the system where you do something meaningful, like what you're talking about? But I think with homeowners now, just bring it to the homeowner level. Never mind global change and the wars that are going to be coming. The most advanced government and understanding on this topic in the world today by a country mile is the Department of Defense in the U.S. government. But to bring it down to a more proximal reality of you're in Edmonton and winning people over, I think it comes down to many people, even if they haven't had it happen in Edmonton or in their immediate vicinity where they've been flooded out or devastated by some extreme event, they may well know a relative somewhere or somebody else that's had it. If you can say to them that through these actions around your house in 3 hours, it lowers the probability of your basement flooding, and by the way, you may receive a risk-adjusted insurance premium, at a small micro level, I think you could win them over to action. And I would start with the small actions first and then focus on the bigger actions later on. And the federal government, by the way, there are aspects. Even the Prime Minister is much more on this file than he admits in the public domain, because right now he's trying to get oil sands and pipelines running, right? So he doesn't want to talk about this too much, but he knows behind the scenes, you got to bloody well move on this file because it's costing the country so much. So there are ways to move the ball behind the scenes, I think, in a less public domain at a federal level, but on a proximal level of community, I would bring it right down to the actions you could do around your house that don't cost you much and produce a return on investment. And I think people would jump on it. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm half answering your question. It's a long answer.
Well, sorry to further address that. In the city of Calgary, that's one of the things we're considering on my panel, the risk management topic. And the other consideration around that is, right now it's in the forefront of everyone's mind. What do we do to build resiliency in the city of Calgary? We just had a flood. But there is a time scale to that, that interest won't be there. It'll sort of wane over time. So that's why we are really pushing, there's a lot of political drive for it right now too, to try to come up with some solutions now while we have the interest. But it is part of our panel to consider how do we educate the public and keep them engaged going forward as years go by, as people forget about the flood.
Looks like we have one more question, and then we can all run off to grab what sandwiches remain in the main hall. Go ahead.
Les Pearson, councillor from the great city of Medicine Hat. Tell us about flooding. We've had 300-year floods in the last 5 years, and many, many places that will never be restored and insured. So a quick question to you. I live on the high ground. Chances of my house flooding are minimal. Long ago, I discovered that if I paid my glass insurance on my vehicle, wait a minute, in 3 years, I could have replaced the windshield on my own. If I get 5 years out of a windshield, I've saved money. What is the risk to the insurance business of people actually saying, the premiums are way too high. If I just stockpile the dough and save that premium, I can do a lot of the repairs to hail damage and all the rest of it myself. Is there a possibility that the insurance business will collapse on that basis?
That's not my sense. I mean, I think most people want that additional security. And I think the industry tries as best they can to price the products and price the peril at at an affordable level. But that's not to say there aren't examples where the premiums are continuing to go up, and as a consequence, someone in your situation is not necessarily adversely affected. One of the challenges we had, for example, when we released our earthquake study was, of all the perils to the industry, that's the one peril that could collapse the industry if a significant earthquake were to happen in Canada. We didn't get one MP to come to our launch. Got a lot of decision makers at the non-elected level, got a lot of media pickup, but it didn't necessarily resonate with the average consumer. So I think consumers will always want that additional security because they feel that there is something that they are going to get. I think, though, and Blair has alluded to it, the more that the price of products, though, continues to rise and rise and rise, then you might find that. And that's why, for example, government, I think, is going to be forced to take some really hard decisions and invest a lot of money, because if consumers such as yourself and others said en masse, we're not going to do this, then at some point, government's going to say, well, that's not tenable either, right? So it's a really interesting public policy debate, and the pivot point hasn't happened yet. But, for example, I mean, you've got to think that homeowners in Calgary, whose insurance premiums have probably gone up quite a bit, I would imagine, are going to be saying to themselves, well, what's the point? Because we know it's going to happen again. We haven't seen enough mitigation efforts, so why don't I just keep the money myself? So I mean, from a public policy perspective, there has to be, I think you will see going forward, a much more substantive debate, and that is a question I think will be a central one.
Thank you very much to our three panelists, and thank you to all of you who stayed a little bit extra for the discussion and questions. Very much appreciate. Safe travels home, everyone.